The forest does not surrender its secrets easily. In the heart of West Africa, where the Niger Delta bleeds into a maze of rivers and ancient woodland, where the air hangs thick with rain and red earth, there existed a civilization so sophisticated, so disciplined, so breathtaking in its artistry and military precision, that when Europeans finally stumbled upon it in the 15th century, they could not believe what they were seeing. They had expected savagery. They found a city that rivaled their own. This was Benin City, capital of the Kingdom of Benin, seat of the Oba, throne of a dynasty that would endure for over 700 years, long before the first Portuguese ship anchored off the Gulf of Guinea, long before the first European trader set foot on the soil of the Niger Delta, long before the world beyond Africa had even begun to imagine what lay south of the Sahara. The people of Benin were building. They were governing. They were creating. The Edo people had lived in this region for millennia. Their cosmology was deep-rooted, their social architecture intricate. They did not merely exist in the forest. They organized it, defined it, named it, and made it sacred. Every tree had meaning. Every river had a spirit. Every ancestor had a voice. The land was not simply land. It was memory made physical. Villages across the dense woodland acknowledged local chiefs. The Edian were men of age and earned authority who managed disputes, distributed land, and maintained the spiritual contracts between the living and the dead. Society was not chaotic. It was layered, hierarchical, precise. A people who understood that order was not a cage, it was a foundation. But foundations crack under pressure. By the early centuries of the second millennium, the villages of Ben had grown. Trade routes deepened, population swelled. The forest could no longer contain the ambitions stirring within it. The old structures, the loose confederacy of village chiefs, were beginning to strain under the weight of competing interests. Who held authority when a dispute crossed village lines? Who commanded when neighboring peoples tested the borders? Who spoke for Benin when the world beyond the forest came knocking? The answer, for a time, was the Ogiso, the Sky Kings, the first dynasty of Benin. Rulers who claimed celestial authority, whose power was said to descend from the heavens themselves. The Ogiso ruled for generations, and their era was one of foundational construction, physical and spiritual. They built the earliest ceremonial structures. They codified early religious practice. They established the first lines of royal succession. But dynasties carry within them the seeds of their own unraveling. The later Ogiso rulers grew weak, distant. Some, the oral traditions suggest, became tyrannical, rulers more interested in the privileges of power than in the responsibilities it demanded. The people of Benin did not accept this quietly. They never had. The Edo spirit was not submissive. It was proud, persistent, and deeply aware of the difference between authority that served and authority that consumed. The last of the Ogiso kings, Owodo, is remembered not for greatness, but for failure. He is said to have been a ruler whose cruelty tested the patience to its absolute limit. When the elders of Benin finally moved against him, exiling him, stripping the dynasty of its mandate, they were not simply removing one man. They were dismantling an entire system. They were standing at the edge of a great historical precipice, staring into the uncertain space between what had been and what might yet become. The Sky Kings were gone. The throne sat empty, and into that emptiness, a question echoed through every compound and every marketplace in Benin City. Who would rule now? It was a question that would take a prince, a warrior, and a visionary to answer. It was a question that would reshape the entire political geography of West Africa. And it was a question whose answer would announce itself, not in whispers, but in the thunder of war drums, in the gleam of bronze, and in the silence that follows the moment a kingdom decides, once and for all, what it is willing to become. The forest held its breath. The story of the Benin Empire, of its bronze, its blood, its brilliance, and its war, was about to begin. There is a story that Benin tells about itself. A story of a prince and a journey. A story of a kingdom so desperate for leadership that it reached beyond its own borders, into the sacred city of Ife, the spiritual heartland of the Yoruba world, and asked for a son of heaven to rule them. The name of that son was Oranmiyan. Whether Oranmiyan was wholly historical or partly mythological matters less than what his story represents. In the oral traditions of the Edo people, his arrival is not merely a political event. It is a cosmic realignment. a declaration that the new rulers of Benin would carry divine blood, that their authority would be woven from both the earth of the Niger Delta and the sacred ancestry of Ife. The elders of Benin had sent emissaries to the Oni of Ife, the most revered spiritual ruler in the Yoruba-speaking world, and their request was precise: send us a ruler worthy of our kingdom. The Oni, the traditions say, honored the request. And so Oranmiyan made the journey south, into the dense forest world of the Edo people, arriving in a land that was not his own, carrying with him the prestige of Ife and the weight of expectation. But Benin did not yield easily, even to a prince. The traditions suggest that Oranmiyan struggled with the Benin court. The Edo language was different. The customs were intricate and unfamiliar. The political landscape was treacherous, full of chiefs who had long exercised independent power, and who were not immediately inclined to surrender it to an outsider, however divine his lineage might be claimed to be. Oranmiyan reportedly described Benin as a land of vexation, a place so complex and so resistant that only a son born within it could truly govern it. And so he fathered one. From a relationship with a Benin woman, a woman of status, a woman chosen deliberately, the union of outside divinity and inside blood, a child was born. That child's name was Aweka. And Aweka would become the first Oba of the new dynasty. The dynasty that would carry Benin from its foundational years into centuries of empire. Oranmiyan departed. Aweka remained. Here, in this origin story, is the psychological architecture of the Benin monarchy fully revealed. The Oba was not simply a king. He was a living intersection, between the human and the divine, between the indigenous and the cosmopolitan, between the authority of ancestry and the demands of the present. Every Oba who followed Aweka carried this duality. Every ceremony, every bronze plaque, every coral, beaded crown was a physical expression of this impossible, sacred balance. Aweka's early reign was not the reign of a secure monarch. It was the reign of a man building legitimacy in real time, against the resistance of powerful chiefs who had their own claims to authority. The Uzama and Ihinrun, the 7 senior chiefs of Benin, were kingmakers. They had the power to install an Oba, and they had the power to remind him daily that his throne rested on their consent. The tension between royal authority and chiefly power would define Benin's internal politics for generations. But Aweka held, and after him, his sons held. And after them, their sons held. Each generation added to the structure. Each Oba reinforced the spiritual and ceremonial architecture of the throne, the elaborate rituals of installation, the prohibition on the Oba eating publicly, the careful regulation of who could approach the palace, and how, the multiplication of royal symbols that placed the Oba increasingly outside the ordinary human world, and inside a sacred space all his own. The throne of Benin was not merely political. It was ontological. To challenge the Oba was not simply to challenge a man. It was to challenge the structure of reality itself. The early dynasty moved through generations of consolidation. Aweka was followed by Uwakwahan, then by Mayan, and so on, names recorded in the royal oral tradition, each associated with specific institutional developments, specific territorial expansions, specific ceremonial innovations. The dynasty was building its house room by room, knowing that the grandest chambers were still to come. But the house needed a warrior to complete it. And warriors, like the finest bronze, are made in fire. The fire was coming. And out of it would emerge a figure who would transform the kingdom of Benin from a promising regional power into something that would terrify its enemies, awe its neighbors, and astonish the world. His name was the Were. And the story of what made him, and what he made, begins in darkness. The throne of Benin was never simply inherited. It was seized, it was earned. And sometimes, in the terrible calculus of dynastic politics, it was paid for in the blood of brothers. Before Iwer became the Oba, who would transform Benin into an empire, he was a prince navigating a court where his life was never entirely safe. Royal courts in pre-colonial West Africa were not ceremonial backdrops for benign succession. They were arenas, places where proximity to power was both the greatest prize and the greatest danger. To be born of royal blood was to be born already in competition. The tradition holds that Iwer, born with the name Ogun, a name that carries the spirit of iron and war, was involved in a violent struggle for succession that would mark him permanently. The oral accounts differ in their details, as oral accounts do, but the central drama is consistent: a conflict between royal siblings. A struggle so violent that it ended with death. And out of that death, a survivor who carried the weight of what he had done into every decision he would ever make. Some traditions say Iwer and his brother Uwefiokan competed for the throne after the death of their father, Oba On. The conflict escalated beyond politics into physical confrontation. One prince died. The other survived. And the one who survived was the one who would rule. Iwer did not remain in Benin City immediately after. There is a period in his story, uncertain in its duration, precise in its psychological significance, in which the future Oba is essentially a man in exile, moving through the forest, living outside the structures of court, alone with whatever haunts a man who has outlasted his brother. This exile was not weakness, it was formation. The Yoruba have a concept, the idea that the Orisha Ogun, deity of iron and war, must spend time in the wilderness before his power can be fully realized. Iwer, whose birth name invoked this very deity, was living this archetype literally. In the forest, away from palace walls and the weight of expectation. He was learning something that no court education could teach: the texture of vulnerability. The taste of need. The specific patience required of a man who has nothing and wants everything. He was also building alliances. A prince in exile is not simply hiding, he is recruiting. The men who followed Iwer during these years, the warriors and hunters and village leaders, who chose to align themselves with a dispossessed royal, were making a bet on future power. Iwer rewarded their faith with what he had in abundance: presence, charisma, a quality of attention that made men feel seen. The great commanders of history have always had this gift, the ability to make the person in front of them feel, for that moment, like the most important person in the world. When Iwer finally moved to reclaim the throne, he did not move alone. He moved at the head of a force. The return to Benin City was not a quiet homecoming. It was a military operation. Iwer fought his way back into power, a fact that the traditions record with a kind of awe mixed with unease. The city, some versions say, was partially destroyed in the conflict. Fires burned, old structures fell. The Benin that Iwer inherited was not the Benin that had existed before his exile. It was a Benin that bore the marks of his passage, a city that had been broken, and was now waiting to be rebuilt. And rebuilding, it turned out, was exactly what Iwer had been born to do. His first acts as Oba were deliberate, sweeping, and radically transformative. He changed his name from Ogun the Iron Warrior to Iwer, a name that translates, in its most resonant interpretation, as, "It is cool," or "The trouble has ended." It was a statement of intent as much as a name. The fire was over. The rebuilding had begun. But to anyone who understood the Benin court, it was also a sophisticated political declaration: I have survived. I have won. And I am not what you feared. I am something more. Then he began to reorganize everything. The palace was restructured. The city was physically rebuilt and expanded. New roads were laid out from the palace to the city gates, roads wide enough for armies to march upon. Roads that declared, in architectural language, that Benin City was now the center of a world that extended far beyond its walls. The famous earthwork system of Benin, the Aya, the extraordinary network of moats and ramparts that would eventually encircle the entire capital and extend across hundreds of miles of the surrounding kingdom. This extraordinary feat of organized labor and strategic planning began to take its defining shape under Iwer. The chiefs who had once held power over the throne found themselves in a different relationship with their Oba. Iwer reformed the chieftaincy system, creating new ranks, new titles, new positions within the palace hierarchy that were loyal to the crown rather than to inherited lineage. He was not destroying the chiefs. He was repositioning them, making them part of a structure that served the Oba rather than constrained him. It was a masterclass in political architecture. And beyond the politics, beyond the city planning, beyond the institutional reforms, there was the war. Because Iwer did not intend to rule a kingdom. He intended to build an empire. And empires are built in one direction, outward. The drums were already beginning to sound. The soldiers were already beginning to train. And at the center of it all, standing in the palace he had seized and rebuilt, wearing the coral beads of a dynasty he had nearly torn apart, and then stitched back together, Iwer the Great was looking at a map of the world around him, and seeing not what was, but what could be. The campaigns had not yet begun. But in the mind of the Oba, they had already been won. War, in the Benin tradition, was not simply violence. It was argument. It was the final, unanswerable assertion of political will. When Ewer marched, and he marched constantly, relentlessly, with a strategic patience that disguised itself as fury, he was not merely conquering territory. He was making a statement that echoed across the forest world of West Africa: the kingdom of Benin has awakened. And it will not be ignored. The military campaigns of Ewer are among the most consequential in the pre-colonial history of West Africa. The traditions credit him with conquering over 200 towns and villages across what is now southern Nigeria, Yoruba settlements to the west, Igbo communities to the east, smaller chiefdoms and city-states in every direction. Each conquest was not simply an annexation. It was an absorption. A careful, deliberate process of integration by which the defeated peoples were brought into the Benin system. Their goods, their labor, their artisans, their spiritual knowledge drawn into the great engine of the empire. The military of Ewer was something the region had never quite seen before. It was organized. It was hierarchical. It was disciplined in the way that only a ruler who has personally survived the chaos of unorganized power can truly appreciate. Ewer understood, at a cellular level, what disorder cost. He had lived through it. And so he built its opposite. The army of Benin was not a collection of warriors mustered in a moment of crisis. It was a standing institution. The generals had titles. The units had functions. The supply chains were maintained. The intelligence networks were real. At the apex of the military structure sat the IS, the Prime Minister and General of the Benin Army, a figure of enormous power and prestige, whose relationship with the Oba was one of the defining political tensions of the empire's entire history. Below the IS, a complex hierarchy of war chiefs managed specific aspects of the military apparatus. Each title carried specific responsibilities, specific ceremonial obligations, specific rights and limitations. The army of Benin was not simply a weapon. It was a bureaucracy in motion. The weapons themselves were formidable. Iron swords, spears, bows. Later, as Portuguese trade introduced firearms into the Niger Delta, the Benin military adapted with remarkable speed, incorporating guns into its arsenal while never abandoning the formations and tactics that had already proven devastatingly effective. The smiths of Benin, masters of iron and bronze, were not merely artists. They were arms manufacturers. The same hands that cast the extraordinary bronze plaques of the Oba's palace also forged the blades that extended his power. But the greatest weapon Ewer possessed was not iron. It was information. The Oba's intelligence network was sophisticated beyond the expectations of a pre-literate state. Traders served as spies. Diplomatic missions doubled as reconnaissance. The pattern of trade relationships across the Niger Delta, Benin extraordinary insight into the political stability, military capacity, and internal tensions of neighboring polities. Ewer did not attack blindly. He attacked when he knew exactly what he was attacking. When the moment was right, when the enemy was divided, when the psychological conditions favored a swift and decisive campaign. And when Ewer marched, he marched with ceremony as much as force. The Oba on campaign was an event of cosmic significance. He did not simply leave the palace. He enacted a ritual departure that communicated to every soldier in his army and every observer along the road that this was not merely a political expedition. This was a sacred undertaking. The gods of Benin were marching. The ancestors were watching. The spiritual authority of the dynasty was being expressed in physical space, in the most emphatic language possible. This fusion of military might and spiritual authority was one of Ewer's most enduring political innovations. An enemy facing the Benin army was not simply facing soldiers. They were facing the concentrated will of a civilization that believed, absolutely, that it carried the favor of forces beyond the visible world. That psychological dimension, the terror of facing something that presented itself not as a rival power, but as a divine mandate, was worth 10,000 additional soldiers. The territories absorbed into the Benin system during Ewer's reign were not merely sources of tribute. They were sources of everything. Craft specialists, wood carvers, bead workers, weavers, were brought to Benin City and organized into guilds that produced the extraordinary material culture of the empire. Agricultural surplus from conquered territories fed the capital and its growing population. New trade routes opened new markets. The economy of Benin during this period was not simply growing, it was transforming. And at the center of this transformation, At the physical and symbolic heart of the empire was the palace. The Oba's palace in Benin City was one of the architectural wonders of the medieval world. Successive rulers expanded and elaborated it across generations. But Iwer Zara established its fundamental character, a vast complex of interconnected courtyards, each governed by different palace associations, each serving specific ritual and administrative functions. The palace was not simply the Oba's residence, it was the government. It was the Supreme Court. It was the religious center. It was the treasury. It was the archive. Everything that mattered in the Benin world pasteurized by it, or was in some way dependent on it. The brass casters, the Igon Oranmiyan Guild, worked within sight of the palace walls. Their work was literally the official record of the empire. The bronze plaques that covered the wooden pillars of the palace were not decorations. They were documents. They recorded battles, ceremonies, diplomatic encounters, royal portraits, scenes from the lives of Obas and their warriors, their chiefs and their gods. In a civilization without writing, bronze was the page, and the smiths of Benin were its historians. By the time Iwer's campaigns had reached their furthest extent, Benin was no longer a kingdom with ambitions. It was an empire in fact. An empire whose capital city, by the accounts of the first European visitors, left observers speechless. An empire whose artistic tradition was producing work of such technical and aesthetically, that centuries later it would still be recognized as among the greatest art ever made by human hands. But Iwer would not live forever. And the empire he had built, magnificent, complex, brilliant, was also fragile in ways that only became visible when the hand that built it was no longer there to hold it together. The tension was building already. In the court. In the chieftaincies. In the borderlands where the empire met the world it had not yet absorbed, the peak was approaching. And peaks, in history as in geography, are always the last moment before the descent. There is a letter, written by a Dutch visitor to Benin City in the early 17th century. A letter sent back to Europe that reads, in its most striking passage, like a dispatch from another world entirely. The writer describes a city of great broad streets, lined with houses of remarkable construction. He describes a palace of extraordinary size, its interior organized around a sequence of beautiful courtyards, its pillars encased in bronze. He describes a people who are organized, sophisticated, and governed by a system of laws that seems, to his evident surprise, to function with remarkable efficiency. He describes the Oba, the supreme ruler, in terms that carry a note of genuine awe. Not the performed respect of a diplomat. The involuntary awe of a man confronted with something that has exceeded his expectations so completely that he is struggling to find the vocabulary for it. This letter was written at the height of Benin's power. Not under Iwer alone, who was the founder of its imperial character, but under the dynasty he established, through the reigns of his successors, particularly through the extraordinary era of Oba Esseji in the 16th century, and Oba Ozoluwa before him. The peak of Benin was not a single moment. It was an extended plateau, a century and more during which the empire functioned at the absolute height of its capacity. Ozoluwa, whom the traditions call Ozoluwa Ambarominiki, Ozoluwa the Conqueror, was in many ways Iwer's spiritual heir. He was a warrior, king of extraordinary reputation, whose campaigns extended Benin's territorial influence to new reaches. The oral traditions credit him with so many battles, some say over 200, that his name became synonymous with martial excellence. To be compared to Ozoluwa was the highest military compliment in the Benin vocabulary. But Esseji, Ozoluwa's son, who ruled in the first half of the 16th century, represented something different. Something more complex and, in retrospect, more interesting. Esseji was a warrior, yes. He fought and won significant campaigns, including a decisive war against the neighboring Igala kingdom, that secured Benin's northern approaches, and established the Oba's authority over vital trade routes. But Esseji was also a diplomat, an intellectual, a ruler who understood with a clarity uncommon in his era that the world was changing, and that the empire which failed to change with it would be left behind. The Portuguese had arrived on the West African coast in the late 15th century. By the time of Esseji's reign, the relationship between Benin and Portugal was established, elaborate, and deeply consequential. Portuguese traders wanted pepper, ivory, and, increasingly, enslaved people. Benin wanted guns, brass, and the prestige of a diplomatic relationship with the most powerful maritime nation in the world. The negotiations were conducted at the highest level, with full understanding of what each side was seeking. Essegi was not a passive participant in this exchange, he was its architect. He sent an ambassador, Ohan Okwen, to Portugal. A real ambassador. An official diplomatic mission to the court of the Portuguese king. The records of this mission survive in the Portuguese archives. Benin was engaging with European power, not as a supplicant or a victim, but as an equal, a sovereign state managing a complex international relationship with sophistication and strategic intent. Essegi also learned Portuguese. Or at least, he learned enough of it to communicate directly, to reduce his dependence on interpreters, to maintain the privacy of sensitive negotiations. In the 16th century, this was remarkable. A West African monarch learning the language of his European trading partners not because he had to, but because he understood that information was power, and that power over one's own communications was not something to be delegated. The court of Essegi was, by the evidence of contemporary accounts, a place of genuine cosmopolitan complexity. Portuguese priests moved through it. European trade goods filled its storerooms alongside the product's own extraordinary craft traditions. The palace was simultaneously the seat of an ancient and elaborate indigenous civilization, and a node in a rapidly expanding global commercial network. And through it all, the bronze casters worked. The 16th century is the period that art historians describe as the golden age of Benin bronzes. The plaques from this era, hundreds of them, are masterworks of portraiture, narrative composition, and technical execution. They show the Oba in formal regalia, flanked by his warriors and attendants. They show battle scenes, tribute presentations, ceremonial performances. They show Portuguese soldiers, recognizable by their clothing and their weapons, standing as their subordinates in scenes that recorded the diplomatic and commercial relationships of the empire. These plaques were not made for export. They were not made for the appreciation of outsiders. They were made for the palace walls, the internal record of a civilization documenting itself for itself, with a seriousness and a commitment to accuracy that speaks to a profound sense of historical consciousness. The Benin court knew it was making history. It knew its story deserved to be preserved. And so it preserved it, not in words, but in method that would last forever. The economy of peak Benin was a marvel of managed complexity. The trade in cloth, ivory, pepper, and enslaved peoples generated enormous wealth. The palace controlled trade access through a system of royal monopolies. The Oba held exclusive rights over certain goods, ensuring that the surplus of commerce flowed toward the center. The guild system, organized bodies of craft specialists, each with their own titles, rituals, and relationships to the palace, ensured consistent quality, and controlled production in ways that functioned, effectively, as state-managed industry. Agriculture in the hinterland was organized around village-level production, with tribute flow poured through the political hierarchy toward the capital. The palace redistributed this wealth downward in the form of gifts, ceremonies, feasts, and patronage. A system that made loyalty economically rational as well as politically required. The military, still formidable, was now augmented by firearms acquired through Portuguese trade. The Benin army of the 16th century was one of the few forces in West Africa capable of deploying gunpowder weapons with tactical effectiveness. This technological advantage extended the reach of Benin's campaigns and deepened the terror of its reputation. Beyond the economics and the military, beyond the political architecture and the trade relationships, there was the ceremony. The ceremonies of the Benin court were among the most elaborate in the world. The Ike festival, celebrating the Oba's mystical power and renewing the divine contract between ruler and gods, transformed the capital into a theater of sacred performance. The palace associations, the Iwigwa, the Ibai, the palace chiefs of the three orders, each had their specific roles, their specific costumes, their specific moments in the annual cycle of ritual that kept the spiritual machinery of the empire functioning. The Oba at the height of Benin's power was something difficult for the modern mind to fully grasp. Not simply a king, not simply a general, not simply a priest, but all of these simultaneously, permanently, and absolutely. He did not sleep publicly, he did not eat publicly. He did not die publicly when an Oba passed. The court maintained a fiction of continuity until succession was secured, because the empire could not, spiritually or politically, acknowledge the mortality of its divine center. This was the height. This was the plateau. This was the moment when everything that had been built, by Iwer, by Ozoliwa, by Esigi, by the cumulative genius of generations, stood at its most complete expression. But history is not a plateau. History is a curve. And curves, no matter how long they rise, eventually turn. The world was changing. The forces that would eventually unmake this extraordinary civilization were already in motion. Some from outside, many from within. And the empire that had seemed, at its height, to be beyond challenge, was beginning to encounter the limits that all empires eventually find. The question was not whether the limits would come. The question was whether Benin could survive them. Empires do not simply collapse from the outside. They hollow out from within, slowly, quietly. Through the accumulation of unresolved tensions, unaddressed fractures, and the gradual calcification of systems that were once dynamic, and are now merely ceremonial. The Benin Empire was no different. Its crisis came from every direction. From the ambitions of its generals. From the competition of its trading partners. From the Atlantic slave trade's corrosive economics. From succession struggles that drew blood from the royal line. And from the slow, terrible transformation of the world that had made it great. The IS problem was perhaps the most persistent, internal crisis of the empire's later centuries. The office of IS, the commander of the army, the second most powerful figure in the Benin polity, was by its nature in tension with the Oba's authority. A successful general accumulates loyalty. Soldiers who have blood alongside a commander develop a connection to him that transcends political hierarchy. And a general who wins wars does not simply serve the Oba, he also inevitably serves himself, building a personal power base that the most vigilant of rulers could not entirely prevent. There were ISs in Benin history who overreached, who plotted, who, if the traditions are to be believed, moved openly against the throne. The palace responded with a tool that was as old as power itself: execution. More than one IS met his end at the Oba's command. A necessary brutality that preserved the throne's supremacy. But at the cost of institutional trust. Each time the Oba destroyed a great general, he weakened very mechanism by which the empire defended itself. The Atlantic slave trade introduced a different kind of poison. The initial Benin engagement with the trade was carefully managed, the palace maintained control, setting terms, regulating access, ensuring that the commerce in human beings served the empire's interests rather than undermining them. But over time, as the trade intensified, as the demand from European buyers grew insatiable, as the network of intermediaries multiplied and diversified, the palace's control began to fray. Independent traders, peripheral chiefs, and allied polities began to engage in the trade on their own terms, bypassing the palace monopoly, redirecting wealth that should have flowed to the center into private hands at the margins. The social consequences within Benin's sphere of influence were devastating. Wars of capture accelerated. The relationship between Benin and its subject peoples shifted. Where once conquest had been followed by integration, now it was followed by extraction. The careful political architecture that had transformed defeated enemies into loyal subjects was corroded by the economics of the slave trade, which made human beings more valuable as commodities than as constituents. By the 17th century, the Benin court was also dealing with a succession crisis that would reverberate for generations. The death of Oba Owan, and the disputed succession that followed, unleashed a period of internal conflict, the period that the traditions describe with particular horror. The civil wars of the 17th century damaged the palace, disrupted the guild system, and interrupted the ceremonial cycle that was the spiritual lifeblood of the empire. For a civilization in which the unbroken continuity of royal ritual was not simply tradition but cosmic necessity, this interruption was not merely a political crisis. It was an existential one. Into this moment of internal fragility, external pressures intensified. The British were now the dominant European power in the Gulf of Guinea, having displaced the Portuguese and the Dutch through a combination of naval force and commercial aggression. The British were not simply traders. They were empire builders, operating through the Royal Niger Company. Then through the British Crown's growing interest in former colonial control over the Niger Delta and its hinterlands. Their goals were explicit: monopolize trade, eliminate competition, and bring the sovereign polities of the region to subordinate relationships with London, Benin resisted. The Oba, by the late 19th century, this was Oba Oranmiyan, a ruler of genuine dignity and political sophistication, understood exactly what the British wanted, and was determined not to give it. He restricted their trade access. He maintained the royal monopolies. He declined to sign the treaties of protection that the British offered and that were, in the transparent diplomatic fiction of the era, instruments of submission rather than alliance. The British were not accustomed to being told no. In 1897, a delegation of British officials, led by Acting Consul General James Phillips, marched toward Benin City despite being explicitly warned by the Oba to wait, that the timing was wrong, that a major ceremony was underway, and the capital was in a state of ritual restriction. Phillips ignored the warning. His delegation was ambushed, whether by forces acting on the Oba's orders, or by independent chiefs acting without authorization has been debated ever since. Almost all of the British party were killed. The British party the massacred. And they used it as the justification for what came next. The punitive expedition of February 1897 was not a military response proportionate to the ambush. It was a colonial reckoning. The concentrated military force of an industrialized empire deployed against a civilization that had, until this moment, successfully resisted the incorporation that had already claimed so many of its neighbors. A force of nearly 1,200 British soldiers and sailors moved against Benin City from multiple directions, armed with machine guns, 7-pound artillery pieces, and rockets. Oba Oranmiyan, facing annihilation, faced an impossible choice: fight and be destroyed, flee and survive. He chose survival, retreating into the forest as the British forces entered his city. What they found there astonished them. And what they did there, in the days that followed, would create one of the most contested legacies in the history of colonial extraction. Benin City burned in February 1897. The British soldiers who entered it, expecting, perhaps, the primitive settlement of their imagination, found instead the capital of a civilization, found the palace with its extraordinary bronze-covered pillars, found the courtyards filled with centuries of accumulated material culture, the plaques, the sculptures, the ivory carvings, the ceremonial objects of a dynasty that had been creating masterworks for 500 years. Found, in other words, exactly the kind of evidence that should have given them pause. It did not. The looting was systematic and swift. Thousands of objects. Contemporary accounts estimate somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 pieces were removed from the palace and its associated buildings. Bronze plaques, ivory tusks, cast figures of extraordinary beauty and complexity, ceremonial objects of deep ritual significance. These were not simply removed as trophies. Many were sold through the British naval authorities, through private dealers, eventually through auction houses in London, to museums and private collectors across Europe and North America. The Benin bronzes, as they would come to be known, became, paradoxically, the instruments of Benin's global fame. Dispersed from their home, separated from the context that gave them meaning, placed in museum cases in London and Berlin and Vienna, they confronted the Western world with an undeniable truth. Here was evidence of a civilization of the first order. Here was art of a quality that could not be condescended to, could not be explained away, could not be fit into the colonial narrative of African primitiveness that justified what had just been done. The aesthetic shock of the bronzes in European museums created a crisis of explanation that European scholars spent decades trying to resolve, producing theories, now entirely discredited, that the works must have been made by ancient Egyptians, by lost Europeans, by anyone other than the West African civilization that had actually made them. The bronzes were too good, they did not fit the story. And so the story had to be bent, twisted and finally inevitably broken. Oba Oranmiyan was captured, tried, exiled to Calabar in 1897, removed from his throne, from his palace, from the city whose spiritual center he was. He died in exile in 1914, having never returned to Benin City. His passing was mourned by his people across the miles of forest that separated them. The man who had tried, against impossible odds, to protect what his ancestors had built, who had navigated the impossible terrain between a civilization of deep integrity and an empire of overwhelming force, died far from home, his title stripped, his authority gone, his body in a place that was not his. But the dynasty did not end. This is the crucial fact. the historical detail that separates the story of Benin from the story of simple destruction. The British, having burned and looted the capital, having deposed and exiled the Oba, nevertheless could not actually destroy what the Benin Empire had built in the hearts and memories of its people. The Edo were not a people who forgot. Their culture was one of extraordinary memorial precision, every ceremony a recollection, every ritual a preservation, every title a living connection to a past that refused to become merely past. Oranmiyan's son, Oweka, was restored to the throne in 1914. The same year his father died in exile. The British, who had imagined they were installing a puppet, discovered instead that they had restored a symbol whose power they had systematically underestimated. The Oba of Benin, even under British colonial authority, even stripped of his military and political sovereignty, retained a spiritual and cultural authority that no colonial proclamation could reach. The palace was rebuilt, the ceremonies resumed. The Guild of BronzMasters, the Igon Aaron I, whose hereditary responsibility to the royal tradition stretched back to the era of Awer himself, went back to work. They cast new bronzes. They maintained the techniques that had been passed father to son across 5 centuries of continuous practice. They refused, quietly and absolutely, to let what they knew die. The colonial period was not a blank, it was a negotiation. A constant, complex negotiation between the assertion of British administrative authority and the persistence of Benin's own institutional self-understanding. The Oba was theoretically subordinate to the colonial structure. In practice, within the Benin world, his authority was never questioned by his own people. 2 systems of authority existed simultaneously, one imposed from outside, one grown from within. And the people of Benin navigated between them with the same sophisticated political intelligence that had characterized their civilization for centuries. Nigeria achieved independence in 1960. The Kingdom of Benin, now within the borders of the new nation, entered a new phase of its long history. The Oba of Benin remained a figure of enormous cultural and political significance, respected by governments who understood that his authority, whatever its formal constitutional status, represented something that could not simply be legislated away. The wound of 1897 did not close. It couldn't. The 3,000 objects, the material record of a civilization, the spiritual heritage of a people, the bronze memory of 5 centuries of history, remained scattered across museums on 3 continents. Every generation of Benin's people grew up knowing where their history lived, knowing that to see the most extraordinary expressions of their ancestors' genius, they would have to travel to London, to Berlin, to Vienna, to New York. That knowledge did not generate despair. It generated determination, and in the early 21st century, that determination began, at last, to produce results. Some things cannot be burned. The soldiers who marched on Benin City in February 1897 had guns and artillery, and the confidence of an empire at the height of its industrial power. They could destroy walls. They could exile kings. They could loot palaces and scatter the objects of centuries across the auction houses of Europe. What they could not do, what no military force in history has ever been able to do, was destroy memory, culture, the deep knowledge that a people carries in its language, its ceremonies, its songs, its stories, its understanding of itself. The Benin Empire, in its political form, ended in the smoke and ruins of a British punitive expedition. But Benin, the civilization, the tradition, the living inheritance of something extraordinary, did not end. It adapted. It endured. It waited, with the specific patience of something that knows it is older than whatever is being done to it. The bronzes are coming home, in 2021 and 2022, after decades of advocacy, scholarship, negotiation and moral pressure that gradually became impossible to resist. Major institutions in Europe and North America began to announce the repatriation of Benin bronzes to Nigeria. The Smithsonian Institution, German Federal Museums, the Cambridge University, the Humboldt Forum in Berlin. One by one, the cultural repositories of the colonial world began to acknowledge what scholars, activists, and the people of Benin had been saying for generations: these objects were taken by force. They belong where they came from. And the civilization that created them is not a museum exhibit, it is a living community with the moral right to its own heritage. The process has been imperfect. It has been contested, complicated, and incomplete. Not every institution has moved. Not every object will return. The politics of repatriation, involving Nigerian federal authorities, the Royal Court of Benin, museum boards, international law, and the competing claims of nations that built their cultural prestige partly on objects they did not come by honestly, are not clean. They are not quick. They are not without contradiction. But they are happening. And the fact that they are happening is, in its own right, a form of historical justice that would have seemed impossible 50 years ago. The Empire of Bronze has outlasted the Empire of Guns. What does the Benin Empire mean now in the 21st century? What does it say to us, to the world that has been shaped, in ways we are still mapping, by the encounter between European expansion and African civilization? It says that sophistication is not a Western invention. That art of the highest order was being created in the forest of the Niger Delta, when Europe was still recovering from the Black Death. That governance, military organization, economic management, and philosophical reflection were not imports to Africa, but indigenous products of African thought and African experience. It says that destruction is not the same as erasure. That a civilization which loses its capital does not lose its soul. That the Edo people who rebuilt their palace, maintained their ceremonies, preserved their casting techniques, educated their children in the history of what had been taken from them. These people were not simply survivors. They were keepers of a flame that burned too bright to be extinguished by colonial violence. It says that bronze remembers, that the objects the British soldiers threw into crates in 1897, treated as loot, as curiosities, as items to be sold, were in fact the most durable form of testimony. They arrived in European museums and refused to be silent. They insisted, through their sheer technical and artistic brilliance, on being recognized. They forced the question that the colonial enterprise had always tried to suppress. If these people were capable of this, what exactly did you think you were doing to them? And it says something about time, about the specific patience of civilizations that have survived long enough to know that the present is never the permanent, that empires are not eternal, that the arc of history does not bend toward any particular power, but toward the persistence of what is genuinely worth preserving. Where the great stood in a palace he had reclaimed after years of exile, and looked at a world waiting to be shaped by his will. He did not know that 5 centuries after his reign, the bronzes cast in his honor would be housed in European museums. He did not know that a British army would one day march through the city he rebuilt. He did not know that his dynasty would survive both of those things, and still be standing in the 21st century, still recognized, still honoring the same ceremonies, still connected by an unbroken chain of memory to everything he had built. But perhaps, in the way that great minds sometimes reach beyond their own moment, some part of him understood that what he was building was not just an empire. It was a record, a statement. A civilization so carefully preserved in bronze and ceremony and oral memory that no amount of violence could entirely silence it. The forest of the Niger Delta still stands. The Oba of Benin still reigns. The Guild of Bronze Casters still works, passing their knowledge, as they have always passed it, from father to son. The bronzes are coming home. And the city that was burned, the city that was looted, exiled, humiliated, is still here. Still Benin. Still casting in bronze. Still remembering everything. Still, after all of it, magnificent.